This is lesson 422 in Feudalism and Manorialism in the Middle Ages. And we've got a picture of a manor right there. European Middle Ages. As we have seen, after 500 AD, the Western Roman Empire was basically gone. And even though it was a gradual process, it was still an unimaginable loss. It was a catastrophe. Western Europe's institutions were basically gone. Let me give you some specifics to help you understand the scale, the breadth, and the depth of how much was lost. Europe's educational system was gone. Its central government was gone. Its laws and its justice system gone. Its unified currency gone. Latin was no longer the common language throughout Western Europe. Education and literacy rates plummeted. Note, all of these things had been declining for some time as Rome slowly declined. There was just one remnant of the old Roman Empire that still retained any hint of these institutions, and that was the Roman Catholic Church. Rome's infrastructure was basically gone. Roads and bridges were no longer maintained. The cities were in disrepair and depopulated. Travel was unsafe. Trade was just a shadow of what it had been. Food was difficult to get. There was no political stability. And as cities depopulated and people moved out of them, life became increasingly rural and provincial for almost everyone, nobles and commoners alike. Germanic kingdoms and the church attempted somehow to reorganize and restore Rome's lost institutions as best they could over the course of generations and centuries. Germanic peoples like the Franks, whom we've studied, became Christians. Germanic kings, such as Charlemagne, were crowned emperors of the Romans by the church. A new political entity emerged, the Holy Roman Empire, and that had the loyalty of many kingdoms. But as this was developing, you had raids and invasions. Magyars, Muslims, and especially Vikings from Scandinavia attacked communities in Europe. Men like Eric Bloodaxe and Thorfinn Skullsplitter would take their longboats and raid cities and villages, plundering and looting, and they used quick hit-and-run tactics. To go a Viking meant to go on a raiding adventure. So Viking is actually a verb, and that's where the Vikings got their name. Vikings were also called Norsemen. They sailed to modern Britain and France, eventually establishing colonies as far east as Russia and as far west as the islands in the North Atlantic. Their homes were in small villages and made of logs or boards. Eric the Red reached Greenland in the year 986. Eric the Red's son, Leif Ericson, reached all the way to the northeast coast of North America, according to Viking sagas. The largest Viking raids came between 850 and 950 AD. At first, there was no organized defense against these savage warriors and their hit-and-run tactics. Feudalism began as Western Europe's answer to these attacks. Feudalism was a political structure whose chief purpose was to provide an organized, reliable defense against outside attacks as well as domestic attacks between domestic lords. So this is the European feudal society. The most important feature of feudalism was the social pyramid structure. And so at the top you've got the king. The next level down is lord, vassals, church officials. That's the most complex layer. Below them you had the knights, and then below them at the bottom were the peasants and or serfs. Feudalism began at the top with the king. The king had noble lords underneath him. He contracted out land to his noble lords, and in return for the use of that land, the lord agreed to a contract with the king. The lord pledged loyalty, military service, and sometimes money. And here's a picture of this lord right here pledging himself to his king. Feudalism, lords and vassals, the next step down. Land given by the king to a lord in exchange for an obligation of loyalty and military service was called a fief. And somebody who pledged loyalty and service to someone above him was called a vassal. He was a vassal to this other person. And this was the most complex and intricate level of the feudal pyramid, this lord vassal part right there, second from the top, just below the king. There were more powerful lords and there were less powerful lords. Every noble was a lord over someone and a vassal below someone else at the same time. So you could be a lord to the people below you and a vassal to the people above you. Every lord had knights on his land to whom he had parceled out some of his fief, and who were obligated to fight for their lord as his vassals in return for this land. Knights did the bulk of the fighting against hostile invaders. Knights were lesser nobles, and knights were specifically trained and equipped for warfare, and such training and equipment was expensive and labor-intensive. Feudalism, peasants, and serfs. At the bottom of the feudal pyramid were the peasants and serfs, people who worked the land. They made up the vast majority of feudal society, and every lord had serfs who were obligated to work his land and the lands of his knights, providing food and income in return for protection. Serfs were peasants who were, quote, tied to the land. And tied to the land means that they were not allowed to leave their lord's fiefs. Serfs were part-time slaves working a certain number of days for their lord without pay. Lords and knights had castle fortresses. Peasants and serfs had the right to flee to these castles in case of attack. So these castles were extremely difficult for an invader to defeat. Feudalism was based on the idea of mutual obligations. The king had a contract with all of his lords. They were vassals to the king, and the king could use that contract to call in any or all of his lords and knights in case all or part of the kingdom was threatened. Feudalism was a system where everybody, from the top to the bottom, had a place working for the security of the kingdom. They either fought to protect the kingdom, or, much more likely, they grew food for the fighters in return for their protection. So now that you have a good idea of what feudalism is and why it came about, watch this short video which sums up what you have learned. Feudalism was a political, social, and military system. It was developed to provide collective security from hostile invaders such as Vikings. Manorialism was the economic side of this feudal system. So manorialism was the perfect economic system for the Middle Ages. Manorialism is great for a society that has very little cash, very few banks, no common currency, few passable roads, few cities or towns, no common language, and very little trade. Manorialism, how it works. If you were a lord and you were granted a piece of land by a king, then everything and everyone on that land was yours to profit from. So a manor consisted of, number one, a manor house or castle, but not just the manor house or castle. The manor also consisted of the land around the manor house and any village on that land, any shops or businesses on that land, and any human beings, peasants or serfs on that land. The manor works because the manor is completely self-sufficient. Everything that was needed on the manor was produced on that manor. It was all done on the manor, by the manor, for the manor. The manor grew its own food. It did its own milling and grinding of grain, did its own blacksmithing, made its own construction materials, did its own manufacturing, did its own repairs, made its own clothing, made its own household items. Keep in mind, there's no infrastructure out there. The roads and the bridges are bad. There's no unified language. There's no currency. Here's another great depiction of a feudal manor. Keep in mind, a manor is much more than just the manor house. So now that you have seen the manor, you've seen feudalism, seen a few castles, watch these two videos on siege weapons.